The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have a couple of major breaking stories that unfortunately are not positive stories to discuss with you today. And at the end of this segment, we're going to have a sort of more general conversation about this that I predict many people won't like, but for different reasons. First, a police officer that may or may not have been off duty at the time shot and killed Russia's ambassador to Turkey, Andrey Karlov, on video, yelling Allahu Akbar, meaning God is great. Do not forget Aleppo. Do not forget Syria. Do not forget Aleppo. Do not forget Syria, as he opened fire. A completely shocking incident. It was caught on video as the Russian ambassador to Turkey was killed, again, named Andrey Karlov. We have video that I'm not going to play. It's not particularly gory. But it's everywhere. It's easy to find, and we've made the call not to play the video here, although I'm not against playing these types of videos, but we aren't going to be playing it today. Very, very easy to find. CNN initially reported that the officer was off duty at the time of the shooting, but Turkish government statements sort of vague about that. They left his duty status at the time of this incident unclear. Russia's foreign ministry is calling this a terror attack. And of course, the connection between Russia and Aleppo is that Russia has been very involved in helping Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his regime try to take back the eastern part of Aleppo. That part of Aleppo had been held by rebel groups for the last 4 years. And we have here a gunman estimated to be 22 or 23 years old, killed during this attack, according to multiple news agencies, including Reuters. We have a number of different angles here that must be discussed. Number one, think about what this means in general for diplomatic security. Local police often work hand in hand or in partnership with Secret Service and equivalent organizations from different countries, including when the United States president goes abroad. And I've thought about this many times. What protocols are in place to ensure that no one from the local country's law enforcement or security may be compromised, or whatever the case may be, many of those individuals armed? And ultimately, Pat, I don't know that you can 100% prevent some kind of rogue foreign security or law enforcement person from doing something like this.
Yeah, I don't think you can. And I think it goes without saying that the crisis in Aleppo, as bad as it is, should not be a justification for you to commit an act of vigilante justice.
No.
But I'm worried that this will actually be counterproductive and will leverage Russia in a way to gain sympathy for their policy in Syria.
Well, there's been questions about Russian retaliation, right? Assuming that this is indeed a terrorist attack, that suggests that Russia would not do anything militarily to Turkey, because again, a terrorist attack is not an act by a country. But there's another wrinkle to this, which is that according to Ankara's mayor, the assailant was an FETO member. FETO is short for Fethullah Terrorist Organization, which is a transnational Islamic movement. So again, this does raise the conversation that we've had many, many times of what is the connection between individual acts of violence or terror and religion, in particular, in this case, Islam. That's going to be a conversation that is already being had unproductively in some circles of the internet, but that needs to be had in a more productive way. I'm going to address that a little bit later, because there have been some on the left who say individual acts of terror perpetrated by Muslims, no matter what they say, don't actually have anything to do with Islam. I find that incredibly not only inaccurate, but also it's sort of like burying your head in the sand, to the extent that we have to be able to discuss all aspects of acts of terror, acts of violence, political conflicts, geopolitical conflicts, etc. And I think that out of hand saying Islam is not a factor here and it just simply does not need to be discussed. Remember, we're talking about an assailant who allegedly yelled Allahu Akbar, who was angry about Muslims being killed in a particular theater. And to ignore that reality is not going to get us closer to any solutions. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Also, yesterday, a horrible, horrible incident in Berlin, Germany, where at a Christmas market, 12 people were killed and 52 injured, or the latest numbers that I have, by a truck that was deliberately driven into a crowd. Most of the victims injured or killed were killed by the truck rampage itself, although there was one victim actually shot dead and found in the passenger seat of the truck used for the rampage. So the suggestion, of course, is that the vehicle was hijacked and that the man found in the truck was the truck's original driver. Now, there's some controversy over the alleged perpetrator here on a number of fronts. Number one, this is an MO that has previously been associated with ISIS attacks. You'll remember the incident in Nice, France, where a truck was also used in this exact manner. That being said, as of right now, and this may have changed by the time you watch or listen to today's program, ISIS has not been blamed, nor has anyone claiming to represent or be associated with ISIS taken responsibility. So that's number one. But there's an additional element here with regard to the alleged perpetrator, which is that we had initial reports that a particular suspect was in custody and that suspect was a male Pakistani refugee seeking asylum in Europe, specifically in Germany. And of course, when that happened, the conversation exploded about Angela Merkel and the perception by some that she is weak on undocumented immigration, on immigration more broadly. That entire narrative has now been called into question. And again, by the time people hear or see this, Pat, some of these details may have changed, but the most recent information from German officials is that they believe that although they have detained a Pakistani refugee seeker, that individual may not have anything to do with this attack, and that the actual perpetrator may be at large in Berlin or other parts of Germany, which is very scary, to say the least.
And I think Angela Merkel is getting ahead of this by saying that this is an act of terrorism, trying to make that reflect well on her, especially as she's running for re-election as German Chancellor.
Yeah.
But I think this also just goes to show that terrorism can be perpetrated by guns, by knives, or it can be something like this, by a weapon that pretty much everyone is entrusted with.
And the idea of X doesn't kill people, people kill people is something I'm going to address a little bit later, because as a general idea, I feel like there's a double standard being applied. And Pat, your microphone is not muted, right? I mean,
It's not muted.
You're on. That's very good. You're on fire. I just wanted to make sure. Sometimes my hearing is not 100% right. I want to make sure Pat comes through clearly so everybody can hear him. Okay, so I don't know that we need to comment any further right now about the suspect specifically, because in spite of the initial claims that this was a Pakistani refugee seeking asylum in Germany, that is not currently known. What we do know is that right-wing pseudo-populism that has risen in Europe is responding very loudly to this. For example, we saw Markus Pretzel, the chairman of the right-wing populist party Alternative for Germany. He immediately tweeted, "When will the German legal state strike back? When will this damned hypocrisy finally stop? These are Merkel's dead." And of course, that assumes a lot about the initial reports with regard to the alleged perpetrator, and sort of ignores the more recent statements by police that they may have the wrong person altogether. Okay, now it is time to have an important and difficult and controversial discussion. We've talked about the assassination by a police officer, unclear on duty, off duty, from Turkey, of the Russian ambassador to Turkey. The yells of Allahu Akbar and of this is for Aleppo, this is for Syria, allegedly an individual, according to the mayor of Ankara, who is associated with a radical Islamist terrorist group. We've talked about the truck massacre in Berlin and the initial allegations that this was a Pakistani refugee seeking asylum in Germany, although now that has been called into question by German authorities, who say we may have the wrong person. Also had the discussion about how the MO, the style of the attack, is similar to not only the type of attack that we know ISIS encourages through training manuals and training materials that have been discovered, but also that was perpetrated in Nice, France over the summer. So all of that being said, how can we have a conversation about the role that Islam plays in terrorist acts perpetrated by individual Muslims. Now, the reason I bring this up is that there are some who hesitate to ever use the term Islamic terror or radical Islam. And there are even individuals who go further, and I get emails from some of them who say, David, even if a Muslim perpetrates an act of terror and says that they did it because of Islam, it still doesn't actually have anything to do with Islam. I think we have to break this down into a few different elements and sort of logical fallacies. Number one, do we have some duty to believe what the perpetrators say? So taking, for example, the instance of the Russian ambassador being killed by a Turkish police officer alleged to be a member of FETO, a radical Islamist terrorist group. The perpetrator referenced Allah during the attack, is an alleged member of an Islamic terror group, referenced a theater where Muslims died as the inspiration for his attack, referring, of course, to Aleppo at the hands of Russian weapons. And still, some will say, well, that has nothing to do with Islam. That doesn't make any sense to me. That does not seem like a logical analysis to me. And to give an example of, there's this horrific ritual that a very small percentage of Orthodox Jews practice around circumcision, which involves using the mouth to suck the blood from an infant's foreskin, penis, right? I can't say that that has nothing to do with Judaism. I can accurately say most Jews don't do that. I can say most Jews find it deplorable. But Judaism is still being used as a justification by those who do it. And to ignore that and to pretend there is no role at all being played would be very silly. The argument that without X, Y person would still be doing Z. Let's apply that to this situation, Pat. Even without Islam, disaffected people impacted negatively by U.S. foreign policy would be committing acts of terror. Well, some of them might be, but maybe not. When someone says, this is because of Islam and because of the God that I follow, we can't ignore that even if we believe that it's a misinterpretation. And to say, even without Judaic teachings that may well be misinterpreted, Orthodox Jews would still be doing the penis-sucking circumcision rituals. Well, it's not totally clear, and I think that we can't ignore that reality.
Yeah, and these religions are derived from books that are, chapters and chapters long. It's very, very thick. And
books and books.
Yeah, books and books. And you can have a lot of different interpretations from that. And some people are more peaceful in how they look at it. Other people are more fundamentalist. You're going to have a wide range of spectrum.
It is not Islamophobic to say that there is a disturbingly high amount of terror coming from followers of one religion. You're not saying that most people that follow the religion are terrorists or bad people. And a better discussion is, given that a small percentage of Muslims are influenced to commit these types of acts by their religion, how can we work in partnership with moderate Muslims to prevent such acts in the future? Burying your head in the sand and pretending Islam has nothing to do with any of this is absolutely useless. And lots of the memes that are sometimes used by the left to disconnect religion from violent actions are memes that the left usually destroys when the right tries to use those memes. Let me give you an example. Donald Trump says he's going to do a ton of crazy stuff. Ban Muslims, at one point punish women for having abortions, punish people for flag burning, all of this stuff, right? When you confront Trumpists with a lot of these claims, they say, we don't have to defend that because Trump's not really going to do it. He doesn't really believe that we should do those things. The left accurately, correctly says, no. The default is we should believe that Trump wants to do what he says he wants to do. If we have terrorists saying they did this for or because of their religion, then at least as far as they're concerned, we should believe that they did. We can still say that's a perversion. You've perverted the meaning of your religion. We can still have that conversation, but we shouldn't say they're wrong. That's not actually why they do it. Let me give you another example. The right often says that tools don't matter in that common phrase of theirs, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And the left correctly responds to that by saying, wait a second, people kill people with the use of the guns that we give them really easy access to. In that same vein, when some on the left like to say religion doesn't kill people, It's people that kill people. Well, along the same lines, let's apply the same critique. People kill people based on their understanding of and how they are influenced by their religion. These are concepts, Pat, that the left won't accept from the right, but somehow are sometimes willing to accept from their own.
And I think it's clear that Islamophobia exists, but we shouldn't be overly sensitized to it and never call it out when we see it.
I think that's what a lot of this stems from. And if the argument is the interpretation of Islamic teachings need not be such that it leads to real world violence, yes, hell yes, I'm on board. And now you're speaking my language. But ignoring Islam as a motivating factor for specific attacks makes no sense, and it is really counterproductive when the left does it. Agree with me? Disagree? Let me know on Twitter at @dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Jeffrey Boggs. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This is mostly viewer-supported media, listener-supported media. So whether it's the podcast, radio show, TV show, YouTube clips that you watch or listen to, membership is how the program is funded. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up. And of course, you can use coupon code IVoted17 to get a discount off of regular prices. You can also support us by donating to our Indiegogo fundraiser at davidpakman.com/donate. And lastly, as you wrap up your holiday season buying, go to davidpakman.com/Amazon before shopping on Amazon. And then the shopping you do will support the work that we do. All right, it's been a solid week for me on Instagram. Of course, I'm on Instagram at david.pakman. There's two themes that seem to do well on my Instagram account, and those are when I'm cooking stuff and pictures of my dad's dog. And we'll deal with the dog a little bit later. Endearingly known as Adderall Dog to many people who watch the show. And I'll deal with that in a second. So yes, I've had a little more time lately. I've been back in the kitchen, and this picture of me, I guess it's people will criticize anything, Pat. In this picture, as you can see, I'm preparing to cook a great chili, and I'm attempting to sharpen the chef's knife that I'm using. And there were 2 or 3 comments, as well as the picture did, people saying, David, I don't know why you're sharpening the knife like that. That is not how you sharpen a knife. I thought you were supposed to keep the knife steady for safety and only move the sharpener.
I just thought that people may not trust you to have a knife like that, a weapon like that.
Oh, it was a more general comment,
Yeah.
like why am I even allowed to have the sharp knives? Yeah, that's a fair question, actually. Okay, so that doing really well. And also the most popular picture of the week from my Instagram account. This is me in a selfie with my dad's dog. This is Nemo. And I referred to him as Adderall Dog the other day because if you don't have food, this dog could not care less what you ask him to do or what's going on. Let's keep that picture up, Pat, if we can. But in order to achieve this, I had to take out what is equivalent to Adderall for the dog, which is food. And I was holding off in my left hand. I was holding a very, very small piece, one of those pellets that dogs just love those pellets. You know, they seem horrific, but yeah, the dogs love the pellets. And I was able to get him to stay still so that I could take the picture. So check it out. People love Adderall Dog, Nemo the dog, Nemo Pakman, as I refer to him. David.Pakman on Instagram. Quite a dog, right, Pat? I mean, he's quite a character.
He does seem quite well behaved in that picture too.
Yeah.
So you succeeded.
Only if there's food involved, and I guess that's common with English labs. People are saying on the internet. A lot of tremendously trustworthy people have told me that. Let's talk about Donald Trump's America. Donald Trump's America is one where being president is really, really good for your personal businesses. And indeed, the Embassy of Kuwait has now allegedly canceled a contract that they had with the Washington, D.C. Four Seasons just days after the presidential election, and they have relocated the event to where? None other than to Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. Why did they do this? They say that there was political pressure to hold their National Day celebration at the president-elect's hotel. The Kuwaiti embassy has regularly held this event at the Four Seasons in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., And a source says that they abruptly canceled their reservation after members of the Trump organization pressured the ambassador to instead move the event to a hotel owned by Donald Trump. Think Progress was also able to review evidence confirming the source's account. And indeed, Kuwait has now signed a contract with Trump International Hotel. That, by the way, is that hotel I told you that shortly after the November 8th election, Donald Trump had like 100 or so diplomats from different countries at that hotel. And some of them came out of that, Pat, saying, oh, well, yeah, when we come to D.C., we'll stay at this hotel because we want to look good for the president-elect. That's exactly what's going on here. This is a payment to the president-elect.
Yeah, and this is the story that keeps coming back. And it's clear that when January 20th rolls around, if he doesn't divest from these assets that have a clear conflict of interest, he's going to be in violation of the Constitution and the Emoluments Clause.
What on earth would it do in terms of stopping the conflicts of interest for Donald Trump to turn over this hotel to one of his kids or to somebody else? He knows about the hotel, and he knows that his family and friends and work and employees stand to benefit from people going to this hotel. Donald Trump doesn't understand the first thing about what a blind trust is. And the first secretary of the Embassy of Kuwait said that he couldn't confirm or deny that they are indeed going to Trump Hotel. Nobody from the Trump organization has commented, but as I mentioned, Think Progress has reviewed the documents. This is exactly what we predicted after that meeting Trump had with diplomats to show them around his D.C. hotel. This is to gain favor with Donald Trump. Why hold an event at the competition? We'll do it at Trump's hotel. And it's also not just Kuwait, because Politico reported that Bahrain also decided to host their National Day reception at none other than Donald Trump's Washington, D.C. hotel. They made the decision on December 7th. That is under 2 weeks after Donald Trump's little show off my hotel to diplomats event in D.C. The kleptocracy could not be any easier and more cushy for Donald Trump. And remember, it's only corruption and pay to play when it's about Hillary Clinton's emails and the Clinton Foundation. What are the values that are being promoted by this type of oligarchy? It's always good to think about how the Trumpists would defend this. If you were to go to Trump supporters and say, look at this, Trump's got this hotel. He's going to be the president. He has diplomats come over and check out the hotel. And then you've got Kuwait and Bahrain, and clearly other countries are thinking about this because they said so after that meeting at Trump's hotel, effectively sending money to the president. I think that they would have two defenses, Pat. One is, hey, he won the business. Hotel business is a free market, and those countries decided completely in the open and free market that the best deal for them was to stay at Donald Trump's hotel. And then the other way that they would defend it would be, my guess, Pat, is they'd say, that's not Donald Trump, the president. That's Donald Trump's organization. Those are two completely different and unrelated entities.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these foreign dignitaries aren't going to realize that this is in direct conflict with our Constitution. No. It's funny, too. This hotel is maybe 10, 15 minutes away from the White House and symbolically right on Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the Capitol.
The letter of this and the spirit of it, based on the short drive from the White House to this hotel, both are very, very clear conflicts of interest. Blind trust, right, Donald? You should figure out what that means before you're quick to say that that's exactly what you're doing. I told you yesterday that President Barack Obama signed a bill on Friday authorizing $170 million for the problem of the lead-tainted drinking water in Flint, Michigan. The water there has been tainted by lead for roughly 3 years. As much as the $170 million will help, even that isn't going to be enough to replace all of the lead-tainted piping that needs to be replaced. Well, Republicans, I'm sure, are getting behind helping to figure out what went on there, right? Right? Wrong. Republicans in the House have quietly closed a nearly year-long investigation into this disaster. They never received really important information from the Republican governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder. And instead they said, oh, you know what we'll do? We'll blame the EPA. On Friday, just hours after the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, Maryland's Congressman Elijah Cummings, called for a subpoena of the Republican governor of Michigan, who we know at this point appointed the emergency manager who decided to switch Flint's water supply. we heard from Congressman Jason Chaffetz that the congressional investigation is over. And instead, we are going to blame Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality as well as the state EPA. Now, Democrats are saying, wait a second. Jason Chaffetz is the guy who was all over investigating what we now know to be the Planned Parenthood hoax. He was all over investigating Hillary Clinton and the Benghazi conspiracy theory. He was all over investigating the IRS non-scandal that we determined was not actually unfairly scrutinizing right-wing nonprofits. This is the investigator in chief. And now Chaffetz, Pat, shuts this whole thing down and says, let's just blame the EPA. How convenient, by the way, when you have an administration coming in that fundamentally thinks the EPA is superfluous and should have less power.
It's almost like you're suggesting that there's a political angle to his investigations. It's interesting, too, when you watch these testimonies, because you have the Democrats blaming Rick Snyder and the Michigan government, and then you have the Republicans blaming the EPA. But who's really responsible here? It's pretty obvious.
It's very obvious, and we also know that 15 past and current members of Rick Snyder's administration refused requests to even talk to the committee before Jason Chaffetz shut it down. The EPA makes a really attractive scapegoat for the right. If you're trying to cast doubt into the value of the EPA, into the legitimacy of the EPA, this is now the paradigm. And once again, and I know that we're saying this a lot lately, lead-tainted water that lasts 3 years should not be a partisan issue. We're talking about water. Whether you think climate change is impacted by human activities on Earth or not, the people who made decisions that prevented clean drinking water from being available need to be held accountable. And this is one of those cases where this is a state issue is being brought up. Air pollution, water problems, these are not issues controlled by imaginary state lines. This reminds me of the smoking area on airplanes. Yes. We've talked about this before. I remember being younger where on flights to Argentina, on international flights, you could still smoke on planes. And I remember thinking, it's a completely enclosed place. What does it mean that we have a smoking section? And in the same way, air pollution and climate change and groundwater tainting and all of this stuff, it does not respect state lines. And the idea that this is merely a state issue is just so ridiculous.
Yeah, these are things that are considered commons. And it goes even further than that. It's not just the lines between countries. I mean, this is a concern to the entire world.
Absolutely. No, not just lines between states, but rather a concern to the entire world. When we talk about radiation coming across the Pacific Ocean to the west coast of the United States, it is so abundantly clear that if we continue with this, hey, we've got lines on the map separating us from other countries. There's lines on the map separating Michigan from other states. We're going downhill quickly, and we're already seeing that. Make sure you discuss this or any other stories on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/Reddit, REDDIT. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Paul Bloom, who is professor of psychology at Yale University and author of the book Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion. So this is such a great topic, and it relates to so much of what's going on in the world and the United States today. Let's start by breaking down some of these terms. When we say empathy, what are we talking about? And when you talk about rational compassion, what's the main difference between that and what we see as empathy?
So thanks for having me on, David. And you began in an excellent way because people use empathy in all sorts of ways. And, you know, as long as we're clear what we're talking about, we could have a productive discussion. So I'm using empathy as many people use it to refer to the feelings of others, experiencing experiences of others, often feeling their pain, feeling their suffering. And I distinguish this. I argue that that's a very bad way to live our lives. It leads us to all sorts of mistakes, political mistakes, personal mistakes. It makes us worse people. And I contrast that with what I call rational compassion. And rationals make sense enough. It's sort of figuring out what to do based on an appreciation of cost and benefits and moral principles. And compassion is the motivator. You need something to motivate you to do good. And compassion is caring about other people. But you can care about other people without feeling their suffering, just by loving them or feeling close to them or wanting them to their lives to be better. And I think that's a better moral force.
And talk a little bit about how that might be applied to some of the regular political discussions that are had. And what came to mind as I was sort of thinking about our conversation is, it seems to me that particularly since people tend to often live, at least politically, sort of in echo chambers that often are confirming their pre-existing biases, selective empathy, for lack of a better term, might actually create pretty significant bias in people in favor of maybe groups or individuals that they're already familiar with, and may not lead to optimal sort of political decisions. Am I sort of on the right track there?
You're exactly on the right track. I think empathy is by its very nature selective. You can force yourself to feel empathic towards somebody who looks different from you, is in a different country, or is your political enemy. But it's hard. It's much more natural to feel empathy for your friends, for attractive people, for people who look like you, for your same race, your same country. And empathy is inherently biased. And so we see this in the political realm all the time. When people want to make arguments, for instance, for violence and cruelty and war, often the way they do so is by generating empathy for people close to you as a way to motivate outrage from people to people far away from you. We saw a bit of that in 2016 with anti-immigrant rhetoric, where a lot of the rhetoric was tilted by saying, look, we want you to feel the suffering of people who are going to lose their jobs, people who are assaulted and raped by immigrants. And this sort of empathy is used to motivate anger against a group. Well, the way any reasonable discussion of immigration should take place is in terms of cost benefits. Who do we have an obligation for? What's the best way to make the world better? But appeals to empathy just muddy things at best, and at worst lead to some really nasty behavior on the part of people.
Well, to take that example, I mean, everything you're saying makes sense, but what seems to be maybe missing, maybe not deliberately so, but what I think might make sense to think about is some of the language you're using starts to take on a sort of utilitarian message or paradigm, this idea that we should just measure, we should try to remove emotion and measure as practically as possible, as objectively as possible, the cost and benefit of any particular decision. But we know about the pitfalls of strictly utilitarian ways of analyzing situations, don't we?
So I'm kind of a lapsed utilitarian. I'm 90% utilitarian, but I push back on some of the problems you're pointing out. So for instance, I love my kids more than I care about you. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So, a true utilitarian would say your life is as valuable as my son's, but I'm not a true utilitarian. I think that in some cases, there are certain bonds that have a reality and should be taken into account. On the other hand, I think we could do to be a lot more utilitarian. I think that that when faced with a situation where if we do one thing, 5 people will die, and we do another thing, 1,000 people will die. I say bring on the utilitarians and choose the act that kills the fewest people. There are so many cases where we don't pay attention to numbers. The world gets much worse. And we congratulate ourselves for being people of feeling, and at least we're not utilitarian.
The immigration example is interesting because we did a pretty detailed analysis of all of the sort of talking points about why both documented and undocumented immigration are bad for the United States. This included the sort of debunked notion that undocumented immigrants and legal immigrants are more likely to commit crime, the non-existent drain on the economy that exists, all of these aspects. And what I came away with that relates to this issue of empathy is you can actually throw out empathy. You can throw out the argument about whether we should allow people in aside from potentially increased crime or economic detriment to the American economy, because those don't exist. You could actually say merely from a utilitarian perspective, it actually does make sense to have immigrants be a significant part of the American economy. And in some cases, it seems like it actually has the opposite effect, where it's this idea that many of those people who are against immigration have, that I am here and I don't want someone who isn't deserving of what I have to be allowed in, when if we took the utilitarian approach, we might come away with something very different. It's sort of a reverse situation to much of what you're discussing, making bad decisions because of empathy. We should actually not be thinking about it, and we might get to a more rational choice in that particular case.
I totally agree. I think for something like immigration, we should crunch the numbers. I mean, it's not merely crunching numbers because there's also moral questions. What are obligations for people in our own country versus other countries? What if people are immigrants and are refugees because of a mess that we cause? What's our obligation? But a lot of it is number crunching. But your analysis is not going to convince anybody who's been swayed by emotional appeals, particularly by empathic appeals. Basically, any large-scale policy is going to have some winners and losers. No matter, I agree with what you're saying, but certainly some immigrants commit crimes.
Sure.
And so so somebody like Ann Coulter will say, I want to tell you a story. And a story be about somebody who's been raped by an immigrant, documented, undocumented, whatever. And many of our audience will listen to that story, and then it will enrage them against immigrants, and they won't care about your numbers. And I'd like to see a world where we'll always be vulnerable to this sort of appeal, but I'd like to see a world where it has a lot less force, it's taken less seriously. We dismiss empathic arguments.
Can you give us some examples? And you have so many that you've talked about. Some are in your book, and some are in other places where you've spoken, of areas or instances where empathy distorts judgment, and whether it's from medical care, education, parenting, marriage, whatever you think might be the most interesting examples to some in our audience.
I'll give two super quick examples. We're talking about policy, but it's also everyday life. So take parents. I've been a parent of teenagers for a while. Your teenage son comes up to you and he's freaking out because he hasn't done his homework and it's due tomorrow and there's crisis and he's very anxious. A good parent listens, understands, loves his kid, but doesn't freak out along with the kid, doesn't share the feelings. So much of what being a good parent is not absorbing the feelings of your kids, not absorbing their pain, but trying to make the world better for them, in some way saying, they're anxious, you're calm. They're sad, you're cheerful. They don't want to do something, you make them do it because it's for their long-term interest. So that's one case. A second case would be a therapist. So you're talking to a therapist and you're very depressed and you're very sad. You want your therapist to understand you. You want your therapist to care about you. You don't want your therapist to get sad. And I guess a third example is a first responder, a firefighter or a cop or something like that, where if you're tremendously empathic in the suffering of other people you experience, you will burn out very quickly. And I've gotten emails and letters from people who have read my stuff and they said, look, you've kind of helped me understand the distinction between empathy and compassion, which is I care about people. That's good. The problem is I feel they're suffering too much, and that's bad.
Any examples with education? I know that's another area where you've spoken about this. How does empathy distort education potentially?
So education is an interesting case because any good teacher has to get in the head of his or her student, have to understand what they know and what they don't know. But again, here too, you need some sort of emotional distance in order not just to be an effective teacher, but to be a moral teacher, to be a good person. I'll give this sort of very mundane example, which is sometimes students come up to me and they're very upset and they want a higher grade, and they might cry or they might just be upset. I'm at Yale, so we grade pretty easily anyway, but still, they might want a higher grade.
Is that true?
And there's grade inflation like crazy. We could talk about that another time.
Yeah.
And I'm being a highly empathic person. I feel their pain, but it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be fair for me to elevate a student's grade simply because he or she is upset, because it's not fair to other students who don't come crying. And here we see just basic fairness requires sort of abstracting away from the particulars, from the particular feelings and emotions of people, and appealing to broader principles.
As a general rule, are there any circumstances you've come across where the variable of whether someone is or isn't crying about something should influence decision making in any way?
It should influence how you act to them. If you have a friend who's weeping, you console them in a different way than if they're not. And certainly people's emotional responses should matter a lot, but you shouldn't. If you feel them yourself, if a friend comes to you in great pain And then you feel the pain. Now you're in great pain too. You've done nothing to help your friend. What you've done actually is you've added a second problem, yourself. And so what a good friend does is supportive and understanding, is sad because their friend is sad, but tries to respond with their friend's interests in mind. It's a case where empathy is in a sense selfish, where instead of trying to help you if you're in trouble, I become absorbed with my own feelings in response to it. And now I'm dealing with myself.
We've been speaking about the book Against Empathy, the case for rational compassion, with the book's author, professor of psychology at Yale University, Paul Bloom. Very interesting and very relevant also in today's political world. Thanks so much for talking to me about this.
Thank you for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
You probably remember North Carolina's HB2 bill. Part of that bill requires that individuals use the bathroom associated with their birth genitalia. Also maybe less publicized, but that bill, HB2 in North Carolina, it banned anti-discrimination protections for LGBT individuals. It basically said municipalities within North Carolina can't pass their own ordinances protecting against discrimination of LGBT individuals. Tons of blowback, loss of business, a terrible PR, a lot of events canceling their plans to go to North Carolina. And that makes sense because it's a totally absurd bill. Well, the North Carolina legislature plans to convene a special session today to talk about repealing that bill. The governor-elect, Democrat Roy Cooper, said yesterday that Republican leaders assured him, yes, we are going to meet to talk about repealing this bill. And I know that this all sounds great, and obviously repealing the bill is good, but this is the epitome of backroom politics. Here's what happened. The Charlotte City Council unanimously voted yesterday in the morning to rescind its ordinance protecting LGBT people. And that was the catalyst for the Republican legislature passing HB2 in the first place. So the basically the backroom deal that was struck was, okay, we passed HB2 banning anti-discrimination ordinances at the municipality level because Charlotte passed an ordinance banning discrimination at the municipality level. So Charlotte rescinds their bill and Republicans will get together and look at rescinding HB2. The current Republican governor, Pat McCrory's office, also confirmed that they would call the legislature into a special session. So here's their statement. Now that the Charlotte ordinance has been repealed, the expectation of privacy in our showers, bathrooms, and locker rooms is restored and protected under previous state law. Governor McCrory has always publicly advocated a repeal of the overreaching Charlotte ordinance, but those efforts were always blocked by Jennifer Roberts, Roy Cooper, and other Democratic activists. There is a lot of political BS going on here. When Charlotte retracts their law, a lot of HB2 is no longer necessary, and you can still discriminate. The real question is what happens after Governor-elect Cooper is sworn in, because there's speculation, Pat, that as soon as this is all done and Cooper is sworn in, that he will then push for statewide protection based on sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah, it seems like this is just a made-up excuse. I mean, this bill, HB2, did a lot of negative things for the state, for the businesses there, and of course for the transgender community, as if they care about that. And, you know, bad reputation for the state. Of course, they're going to try to repeal it.
Not only that, this is also blamed. This ridiculous abortive law called HB2 is blamed. Pat McCrory, the Republican governor, did not lose by much in that North Carolina gubernatorial election. And there are absolutely moderate Republicans who opted not to vote for Pat McCrory, not necessarily voting for his opponent, but maybe just not voting at all. And you can make a very strong case that HB2 alone is responsible for Pat McCrory losing re-election there. Now, what ultimately happens is really important here, obviously. But regardless of what happens, this entire thing is the worst of gutter politics. The using people's ability to live free of discrimination as a political move on the proverbial chessboard. And as Pat mentioned, financially, it's been terrible. And this is the type of politics that is the worst of American politics. I obviously hope, with regard to the law, that it's repealed and that then Roy Cooper sticks it to them by passing a full protection statewide of sexual identity and gender and sexual orientation protection. But this is just horrible politics at its absolute worst. Major theme of the Donald Trump campaign was globalism, or as Alex Jones liked to say, globalism. The Trumpists, the InfoWars crowd, the Alex Jones types, we must protect ourselves from the globalists who believe in stuff like world government and that globalism is good. And of course, globalism defined is a geopolitical policy where the entire world is seen as the appropriate sphere for a state's influence. And this includes the development of social, cultural, tech, or economic networks that cross national boundaries. Right-wingers, supposedly, are against globalism. They are for the U.S., in contrast to every other country. This was one of the main fear-mongering techniques of many pro-Trump right-wing media outlets. Alex Jones has been screaming about globalists for years and years. Trumpists voted Trump because he wouldn't be like the globalists. He was going to put America first. Except now, Trump is filling his cabinet and advisory positions with the same so-called globalists that I thought were bad during the campaign. We've got Rex Tillerson, the CEO of a global oil and gas company. There is nothing more globalist than that. You've got Goldman Sachs' Gary Cohn, who's going to head up the Economic Council. You've got Steve Mnuchin, who is going to head the Treasury Department. And you've got Anthony Scaramucci from Goldman Sachs, who's a key Trump transition member. What is more globalist than Goldman Sachs? And remember Trump criticizing Hillary Clinton's ties to Wall Street and her speeches. Now Trump is hiring all the people Hillary gave the speeches to. And then, of course, you've got Wilbur Ross, who's going to be Trump's commerce secretary. Guy's worth nearly $3 billion, made a ton of money buying companies and sending jobs to Mexico. There's no bigger globalist, Pat, than Wilbur Ross.
Yeah, this really just goes to the idea that Alex Jones is playing a character. And at some point, he's going to have to flip the script on Trump because his whole thing is being against the status quo, whether it's Democratic or Republican.
Yeah.
He just hasn't come around to that yet.
Yeah, I was talking to some people the other day who said, Alex Jones, when Trump was the guy trying to get elected, it made sense for Jones's narrative to be rah, rah, rah pro-Trump. But at some point, he's going to have to go against Trump. And by the way, I forgot to mention, Rick Perry is going to be Secretary of Energy. Breitbart and Alex Jones have been pushing the whole Rick Perry is a globalist thing for years. These Republicans, these Trumpists, they care more about the fact that Democrats lost rather than what Trump is going to do, because Trump is going to do terrible things that even they claim to be against during the campaign. And again, Trump slammed Hillary's speeches and is now filling his cabinet with the people that paid Hillary Clinton to give the speeches. If you think I'm talking nonsense, here is Anthony Scaramucci, one of the Goldman Sachs buffoons I mentioned, who's on Trump's transition team. He went on MSNBC with Chris Hayes and said, we need to protect globalism.
We're going to have a great relationship with China.
Okay.
All the president-elect is saying is that we've got to create fairness in that relationship. And I said something recently to one of the sovereign wealth fund people that came in. At the end of the day, the last hope for globalism is that we fix the problem in the middle class and the working class of the United States. And you and I have talked about that.
Sure.
If we fix that problem and we create a redo on that burgeoning market of consumption, that's going to be phenomenal for China and for the rest of the world. And so we want to have a great relationship with China as we do with all the other nations.
Yeah, the last hope for globalism. Globalism is good. We need Trump to save globalism. But wait a second, Alex Jones and all those types are against globalism, but they're for Trump. But it's clearer and clearer that there is no bigger globalist than Trump. And that's because it is all a farce. Trump attacked globalism during the campaign. Here is a tweet that Donald Trump published. Hillary says things can't change. I say they have to change. It's a choice between Americanism and her corrupt globalism. And this is effective because it evokes terrible imagery of shuttered factories and out of control undocumented immigration and some kind of worldwide cabal that controls everyone's lives. Oh, and by the way, the entire way in which Trump slammed globalism had serious anti-Semitic appeal, as the Anti-Defamation League pointed out. Just replacing the word Jews with globalists. People voted. It worked. And now the globalist in chief is coming to town, and the Trumpists don't even know enough to say, I don't like this. We have a voicemail number. It's 219-2-DAVID-P. Very weird voicemail today. See if we can make sense of this. See if you think that this is for real.
Hi, David. This is Todd Smith. I am a Democrat. I am a gay man, and proud of it because of gay men like you. But I have kind of a problem. Well, I can hold my head up high because of men like you. You know, it's just tough. But I want to tell you, my problem, as soon as Trump won the election, my boyfriend, who is Republican, has been bullying me. He takes advantage of me because he is bigger and stronger. So now I have to let him have me whenever he wants to do it. And it's just not fair.
Right.
But instead of saying he's going to hump me, he now calls it trumping me. He thrusts harder and deeper than he used to.
Right.
And it hurts. What can I do? Please help me, David.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Pat, is this for real or is it trolling?
This has to be a troll.
Okay.
John Smith, I mean, come on.
Todd Smith.
Todd Smith. Oh, okay.
If it's trolling, then it's clever. If it's not trolling, it's called sexual assault, and you should call the police. I don't think I have too much else to add to that. On the bonus show today, solar power now producing a better energy return on investment than oil. Half of Americans support giving residents a $2,000 a month basic income when robots take our jobs. And much more. DavidPakman.com/membership. Coupon code IVoted17 if you'd like a discount. And please donate to the Indiegogo campaign at DavidPakman.com/donate. Read all about it there.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.